This video will be part 2 of my coverage of social cognitive theory and cognitive therapy for PSY 230 personality theory. Where we left off last time was talking about the components of observational learning. Now we need to look at what are the necessary conditions that you have to set up in order for observational learning to occur. It requires a combination of cognitive aspects and behavioral aspects. And a lot of what's going on in observational learning is internal to the learner. So we have to first think about the fact that you need to be able to pay attention to the person that you're observing. So you pay attention to the model, you watch what they're doing. Then you have to actually remember what you've seen, what you've observed, so that you can reproduce that. That reproduction shows basically evidence of learning. Now, what's going to prompt you to repeat what you have learned, to reproduce it again? That requires motivation. What about perfecting it? So, you can observe a model, and the first time you can make an attempt at performing the task that you've observed, and it may be, less than well practiced. So practice then enables you to perfect the behavior that you've observed. I found this graphic just through a Google image search, but basically you have to think about how observational learning incorporates the cognitive aspects of memory and attention. It also requires behavioral production of a behavior, and then wraps around to motivation when you're talking about whether or not you will actually engage in the behavior. So on the cognitive side, we have attention and memory. So first, if you're learning how to drive a car, you need to pay attention to the other person who's driving. So like with one of my kids, when she was learning to drive, we would call her attention to what we were doing as we drove, my husband and I. Sometimes she was motivated to watch what we were doing, sometimes not so much. So she learned more through observation when she was actually paying attention. Then you have to actually retain what you have learned so that you can then put it into play. So for example, where on the steering column are the turn signals? Where are the wipers? How do you turn on the wipers? Are the lights automatically on? Do you have to turn them on? Where is the gas pedal? Where is the brake pedal? How hard do you have to push that brake pedal? All of that stuff has to be retained in memory. Then, when you're actually practicing the behavior, what you're doing is actively recalling what the steps are, and over time those behaviors become more automatic. Now, then as you're engaging in that observational learning, it eventually will become independent of the observation itself, so that your motivations come into play. Do you actually want to drive? Is there somewhere you want to go? And when will you leave? How do you get there on time? And so on. So what Bandura has done with observational learning in his model was to remind us just how much brain action is actually going on in the learning process. We are using our attention system, our memory system, our motor production system, and then that wraps back around to retention and memory. And then ultimately we have to choose whether we're going to exhibit the behavior or not. And that may come down to, in some cases, whether we've observed others who experienced either reinforcing or punishing outcomes as a result of the behavior, and we will then decide whether or not to exhibit the behavior ourselves. Another concept that Bandura studied extensively was something called self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is the degree to which people believe that they have the capacity to bring about an outcome that they want. So, for example, if I'm teaching a young person how to ride a horse, and the student is saying, when I ask, do you think you're ready to canter your horse? And the student may say, yes, absolutely, I am ready to canter my horse. Or the student may say, not sure, I don't think so, I think I'll fall off if I try. So self-efficacy is the degree to which you think you have the ability to pull off something that you desire to do. Some people have very high self-efficacy. Sometimes we describe that as being very confident in our abilities. But self-efficacy actually really it's more than just confidence, because sometimes confidence can be false. Self-efficacy is a real self-reflective evaluation of your ability to affect change in your world. So essentially what self-efficacy is you kind of sitting back, observing your own behaviors, reflecting on your skills and abilities, and deciding how likely it is that you will be successful in performing whatever task it is that you're setting out in front of yourself. It's not about what you will or won't do, but it's a belief about the likelihood of your being successful in that outcome. Now, from a mental health standpoint, people who are anxious or depressed or both tend to take a hit on their self-efficacy. But the reverse may not necessarily be true. So Bandura looked at self-efficacy as its own kind of bridge between our learning systems and our motivational systems. Self-esteem is a global judgment on your worth. So self-esteem and self-efficacy tend to be correlated, but they are independent things. So your self-esteem is really your sense, me as a whole person, am I worthy? Am I good? If we have high self-efficacy, we do tend to also have high self-esteem, and vice versa. But it's not clear at all what the causal connection between those two is. Self-efficacy, just to reinforce the point, is about expectations of success. So kind of separate that out from how you feel about yourself globally in terms of your worth and your value and your overall goodness, and how good you feel about yourself. Self-efficacy is very much task-oriented. One of the areas that Bandura studied a great deal was the area of academic self-efficacy. He was a lifelong teacher. He wasn't one of these researchers who spent all of his time in the lab and only taught graduate students. He actually spent a great deal of time teaching undergraduates throughout his career. And he was very, very interested in what was the difference between students who worked hard and saw good outcomes academically and students who struggled academically. And he found that one of the variables that mattered a great deal was this thing called self-efficacy. Many students, he found, that were also academically struggling were students who really did not have confidence that they could actually be successful students. So it was their perception of self-efficacy that was problematic. When their self-efficacy was raised through a variety of interventions, their performance tended to improve. And it was this mindset that really seemed to make the difference. So where does self-efficacy come from? One of the sources that Bandura was able to show mattered was giving, so in the context of academic self-efficacy, for example, if you can set up a situation where students who previously felt very low self-efficacy about their academic performance, if you set them up to succeed on a number of tasks and build their self-efficacy, they tend to then be more resilient and more successful in more difficult tasks down the road. Also, if you can show them that people like them have been successful in the past. And he noted that, for example, for some students who came from, who were kind of considered when they came into school to be quote unquote at risk, so maybe their academics were a little weaker than the rest of their class, maybe the scores and things like that from their school system were a little lower on average. Maybe they were first generation college students, so for whatever reason, they didn't have a lot of role models for high success in college. If they could be shown that someone similar to them was being successful, it tended to boost their self-efficacy. Also, coaching people to imagine themselves being successful. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, but I've had this experience with some students who had low self-efficacy about their schoolwork. When I sat them down and broke the skills apart and have them imagine successfully completing them, their self-efficacy tended to go up. You can also use verbal persuasion. So in coaching students in to think about their academic self-efficacy, or like in my experiences teaching horseback riding lessons, for example, using a lot of verbal persuasion can encourage people to try things even if they don't have an internalized image of success. They may try it because you've persuaded them, and then if they have a successful experience, it bolsters their self-efficacy. And then finally, and this one isn't intuitive, I think 1 through 4, those are intuitive. You can imagine how those would influence self-efficacy pretty readily. However, there's also bodily states that influence self-efficacy. When we are in a high arousal state, when we are excited, we tend to have to label that. So if they make an attribution to explain what they're experiencing emotionally, let's say I have that kid that I'm teaching horseback riding, and I've given them a new challenge, and they find, the experience kind of gets them excited, and they feel that physiological arousal, and they identify it as excitement, especially if I, as the teacher, show excitement at their successful performance of the task, they will attribute their physiological and emotional arousal to that success. In contrast, if they're fearful and anxious and they interpret their experience as fear and anxiety, that kind of stimulates avoidance behavior. But if they label their experiences as excitement and an effect of the challenge of the experience, then they tend to be more excited about it, and it increases their efficacy as they go forward. Now here's another graphic that I found on Google Images. I think it just expands the previous slide. When we perform and we have accomplishments, or if we're watching others perform as well, that would be vicarious experience. We're participating, but we're also reflecting on our own performance. If it's a new task, we have to be desensitized to performing the new task over and over while being watched. And simply the exposure of doing the behavior itself repeatedly can make us feel more and more comfortable with it, and having opportunities to practice, whether it's in private or not, that kind of self-instructed performance can bolster self-efficacy. On the vicarious side, if you're watching actual live people or you're imagining models, those can be experiences that help you see yourself performing the behavior, and that can improve our efficacy. Persuasion can involve suggestion, really motivational talk. You can also persuade yourself verbally by giving yourself instructions, and kind of your internal voice of your internal coach kind of pushing you. On the arousal side, making the right kinds of attributions can improve self-efficacy. If it's a situation where you want to improve your efficacy to ward off a sense of anxiety and worry about performance, learning to relax before going into a performance situation can help you to modify what kind of experiences you're having in response to a particular event. To pull some of these ideas together, how do we build self-efficacy? And as I said, he did a lot of his research in the area of academic performance and academic self-efficacy. So one, you really have to build in success experiences. One way to really crush a person's sense of self-efficacy is to give them the hardest possible task with the lowest likelihood of success possible and give it to them first. What you do instead is give them a task that is just challenging enough to give them, to keep them interested, but not so challenging that they cannot be successful. So you kind of move them into tasks that later are going to be quite difficult, but you start them with parts of the task that are attainable with a relative amount of ease. So difficult enough, but still quite achievable. That way people get some initial successes that they can easily build upon. Also, have them observe models that do the tasks successfully, because that can give them, their eyeballs on the actual thing, and it helps them to move if it's a physical task, when you are watching another person performing a behavior, your brain, and this is just how we've evolved, your brain will literally, in the motor cortex, will be patterning off of what you are seeing. Not that you will be able to immediately do exactly what you've seen. There's a learning curve there, but your brain is trying to track those physical movements of the model that you are watching. You have to, if you're going to enhance self-efficacy in another person, you have to give encouragement when that person is performing successive approximations of the behavior that you want. So giving that encouragement can help people to perform better. He also suggested that you have to feed the whole person. So this last suggestion here in terms of enhancing self-efficacy is that if you have an impoverished learner, if you have a learner that isn't healthy, and this is particularly relevant to his research on academic self-efficacy, but it can relate to other aspects of life. If there are limitations in terms of your ability to get enough to eat, the stressors in your life, your ability to exercise and increase your strength, your ability to relax, it interferes with your motivation system, it interferes with your attention system, it interferes with your ability to remember things. And I'm sure, shockingly, we've all been challenged immensely over the last 2 years in all of these areas. So it's not surprising that a lot of people, including my students, seem to be suffering from a diminishment in self-efficacy when it comes to their work academically. So part of what's happening is that when we are not able to take care of ourselves as whole people, we tend to lose some of the ability to do the self-regulation necessary to be successful in task performance. Now, shifting gears a bit, how did Bandura define the self? Bandura, you can get the picture here. He sees people as behavior, but also as a set of cognitive elements and structures. So he looks at human beings in a fairly holistic way, but in a very pragmatic one. So the self becomes kind of this collection of cognitive operations, so memories, motivations, attention and memory systems, and so on. What we do with all of that, those cognitive skills, is we use them to make sense of the world around us, to perceive things, to evaluate them, and to control our own behavior. He did not subscribe to like the image of the ego or the self as defined by the psychoanalyst. He didn't see it as this kind of internal psychological agent that's independent of its social world. Remember triadic determinism. You have the active mind making sense of the social context, the world, the environment, and then your behaviors in it. So he saw us as actively perceiving beings, and that really defines the self for him. And that puts into context his study of self-efficacy and self-regulation. He felt that one of the important aspects of understanding the human experience is knowing how we learn to govern ourselves as independent beings. He didn't need to have all kinds of difficult to operationalize concepts like defense or dynamics. Instead, he kind of boiled it down to fairly agreed upon cognitive processes, such as attention and memory, that are then made even more complex in the form of our ways of conceptualizing the world. So he brings in here the concept of attribution. How do we ascribe cause and effect to the things that go on around us? And without that capacity, there is no self-efficacy, there is no self-regulation. So he's defining the self in fairly cognitivist terms, and then allowing it to play itself out in the form of behaviors in the real world. He does agree we receive various reinforcers for our actions from people in our environment and directly from the environment itself. And when those reinforcements come for our behaviors, it strengthens them, and those behaviors can become habits. We can also find there are times when our behaviors lead us to bad outcomes, and we will tend, in some cases, to then fade those behaviors out because they are no longer effective. We also, and Bandura made a point of this, that one of the ways in which we structure our understanding of the world is by goal setting and setting standards for our own behavior. We can set moral standards. Sometimes we set personal goals and aspirations for our behaviors, and we actually do a great deal to reward ourselves, to reinforce ourselves when we're able to achieve those goals. Think about times when you've said to yourself, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to take these steps to achieve that goal. And remember how good it felt when you actually were able to achieve that goal. And you may have, as you were achieving little steps along the way, you may have said to yourself, you know what, I deserve a reward, and you may have given yourself some little gift along the way. And that's one of the ways in which we self-regulate behavior. So what he's saying here is that goal setting is a real hallmark of the human capacity for self-regulation and for growth. So one of the ways that Bandura talked about personal growth is in terms of this self-regulation system, where we can look at ourselves in the past, we can look at ourselves in the future and say, I would like to move myself from point A through point B to get to point C, and here's what I need to do to get there. And I feel confident, I feel self-efficacy that I can do it, and then I can use my self-regulation skills to get me there. Now, what gets in the way? If we have low self-efficacy, if we have low self-esteem, if we experience anxiety and depression, that may interfere with our ability to set goals and then actually achieve them. So that concludes part 2 of my coverage of social cognitive theory and cognitive therapy.